Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. So today I will talk about war crime. First of all, my name is Jannatul binti Hasan Aghare. My contact number is 060090. So let's move on to the first part for the introduction. A war crime is a violation of the laws of war that results in individual criminal responsibility for the actions of combatants, such as the deliberate killing of civilians or prisoners of war, torture, hostage-taking, willful destruction of civilian property, perjury, for some sexual, pillaging, and for anyone in the command structure who directs an attempt to commit mass killings, including genocide. The The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 for international war and the Labor Code 1863 of the Union Army in the American Civil War both codified the customary international law that applied to hostility between sovereign states and gave rise to the legal idea of war crimes. The Nuremberg Principle of Law, which include the definitions of a war crime in international criminal law, were developed in the wake of the Second World War by the war crimes trials of the Axis power leaders. The Geneva Conventions provided that the governments might exercise universal jurisdiction over war offenders and formally defines new war crimes. However, war crimes are not always committed following international humanitarian law. A violation must result in the offender's criminal liability and under customary or treaty law for it to be regarded as a war crime. In both international and domestic armed conflicts, war crimes are major international humanitarian law or violations that are punishable by the law on an individual basis. War crimes are prohibited by some international humanitarian law, which from customary law and treaty law provisions, including grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 1 AP1, which applies in international armed conflict. Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, which apply in all conflict and other serious violations of international humanitarian law, which apply in either internal or external armed conflict. So for the second part of the presentations, the background of the war crimes. During the early history of war crimes in 1474, Peter von Hagenbach was put on trial for the first war crime by an ad hoc tribunal of the Holy Roman Empire because of his common responsibility for the activities of his soldiers and because the thing that he quoted, he as a knight was believed to have a duty to prevent unlawful behavior by a military force. Von Hagenbach claimed he had merely followed orders from above, but he was found guilty, given the death penalty, and decapitated. The concept of war crime emerged basically at the end of the 19th and the beginning of 20th centuries, where international humanitarian law was also known as the law of armed conflict, was codified, even though the prohibition of specific conduct in the conduct of armed conflict can be traced back many centuries. The Hague Conventions, which were ratified in 1899 and 1907, are primarily concerned with providing warring parties from employing particular tools and techniques of war. Since then, several further similar accords have been adopted. In contrast, the protection of people who are not or are no longer participating in hostilities is the main focus of the Geneva Convention of 1864 and later Geneva Conventions, particularly the four Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the two additional protocols of 1977. Several of the transgressions of its rules are classified as war crimes by both Geneva and Hague law, albeit not all of them are. However, there isn't a single piece of international law that codifies all war crimes. The additional protocols and other international humanitarian law accords have not yet attained the same level of recognition as the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which have been ratified by all United Nations members. Many of the laws outlined in these treaties, however, have been regarded as a component of customary law, and as such, regardless of whether states have ratified the treaty themselves, are binding on all states. The protection provided in non-international armed conflicts, which are only covered by Common Article 3 of the four Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 2, is also expanded by the fact that many rules of customary international law are applicable in both international and non-international armed conflict. So I will move on to the elements common to all war crimes. According to international law, war crimes are those transgressions of treaty or customary international humanitarian law that give rise to personal criminal liability. Because of this, and in contrast to crimes against humanity and genocide, war crimes are always committed during an armed conflict, whether it be international or domestic. There are 6 elements common to all war crimes. So, for the elements common to all war crime, the first one is armed conflict, where the alleged offences must have occurred during or near an armed conflict. The first prerequisites for a crime to qualify as a crime is that it must have taken place during an armed conflict. It must be established whether the conflict had an international or domestic scope for prosecutions. Non-international armed conflict is defined as protracted armed violence between governmental authorities and organized armed groups, or between non-government armed organizations within a state. An international armed conflict is defined as the use of armed force between states. An armed conflict can take on both international and international characteristics in one of two situations. First, another state sends soldiers to interfere, or second, some of the participants in an internal war act on behalf of another state. Both parties don't need to use force in military confrontations, whether they are international or not. Inventions that encounter no resistance, area bombing, or unauthorized border crossing by armed forces are all considered acts of armed warfare. When there is internal armed conflict, the state of armed conflict lasts until a peaceful resolution is reached or until there is a general declaration of peace. Armed war can also be declared over by conclusively ending military operation without settling. The second one is protected person. According to international humanitarian law principles, only military goals may be pursued in the course of an operation. Military goals are combatants and items that, by making an effective contribution to military operations and whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization, given the circumstances prevailing at that time, give a clear military advantage. The simplest and most direct application of these principles is when war crimes are committed by planning assaults on civilians, the civilians' populations, or against civilians' objects. Protected individuals are typically defined as civilians, prisoners of war, and combatants who are ill, injured, or shipwrecked and are therefore unable to continue fighting. In cases where it is unclear what status a person has, they are assumed to be civilians. In international humanitarian law treaties, specific types of property and property rights are also protected. Cultural artifacts, other everyday items, military hospitals, and ambulances are all examples of protected property. On the other hand, some violent acts such as the destruction of military equipment or the execution of enemy combatants are not considered war crime when they are carried out in compliance with the existing law of armed conflict. The third one is nexus. War crimes are always crimes committed during an armed conflict or an occupation. War crimes are only those offences that are closely related to an armed conflict. The prosecutor must at least show that the armed conflict played a substantial part in the perpetrator's ability to commit it, his decision to commit it, how he committed it, or the purpose for which he committed it to establish whether the crime was closely related to the armed conflict. It suspicious if the accused took action to further or mask that dispute. However, it is not suspicious to just establish that the crime was done at the same time as an armed conflict or in an conditions produced in part by the armed conflict. The alleged crime and the armed conflict do not need to be strictly linked geographically to meet the linkage criterion. The question of whether the alleged crime was done to promote the situations brought about by the war, or at the very least under the pretense of it, applies to all crimes that were committed in location unaffected by the actual conflicts. The offences must be substantially related to the theatre of hostilities, which includes all the territory possessed by the combatants. By connecting the crime's time and place to the armed war, this is demonstrated. The fourth one is the gravity. According to the statute of both the ICTY and ICTR, only severe breaches of the rules and custom of war are under purview, and only such breaches are subject to individual criminal culpability under their responsive statutes. This requirement does not apply to infractions of numerous technical law and other IHL-related components. An IHL violation is serious if it represents a breach of a rule defending important value, and the breach must include grave implication for the victims. All major violations of the Geneva Conventions are considered to be grave international humanitarian violations. So, for the fifth element is individual criminal responsibility. International humanitarian law violations must include individual criminal liability regardless of whether they are based on custom or a treaty, as long as customary international law support the application of criminal responsibility. Treaty clauses do not necessarily need to indicate that violations will result in criminal liability. Common Article 3 does not specifically mention individual criminal culpability, for instance. However, the ICTY Appeals Chamber has determined that individuals can face criminal charges for violations of these articles under customary international law. The egregious breach of several of additional provisions to most essential provisions was criminalized under the ICTR and ICC statutes to reflect international customary law, even though additional provisions too did not allow for individual criminal culpability. So for the last element is awareness. According to some national jurisprudence and the ICC elements of crimes, a person cannot be found guilty of committing a war crime unless they are aware of the specific factual situations that qualify their action as such. Each war crime must also meet the requirement that the criminal knew of factual conditions that establish the existence of armed conflict. The ICTY's Appeals Chamber has stated that the criminal must be aware that there is an ongoing armed conflict. The accused at the ICC must be familiar with the factual circumstances that prove there were an armed conflict. The offences covered by Common Article 3, the prosecutions must further demonstrate that the defendants knew or ought to have known that the victim was not actively participating in hostilities at the time of offence was committed. The measure for all violation of Article 2 grave breaches at the ICTY encompasses both recklessness and guilty intent. The appeal chamber has acknowledged that both direct and indirect kinds of intention are included in the mens rea. So for the last part is the conclusions. In conclusion, in contrast to genocide and crimes against humanity, a variety of victims, including combatants and non-combatants, can be the target of a war crime, depending on the crime's kind. Victims of international armed conflicts include prisoners of war, civilians, and injured and killed and ill members of the armed forces on land at sea. Protection is given to people not actively engaged in hostilities in non-international armed conflicts. This includes military personnel who have laid down their weapons, and others who are otherwise hors de combat due to illness, injuries, captivity, or other circumstances. Protection is also given to medical and religious personnel, humanitarian aid workers, and civil defense personnel in both sorts of conflict. Therefore, I think that's all from me. Thank you.